Good evening, my peepers. Welcome to Shalene's Creativity Room. This is my third take. We are stitching out of the 2013 Just Cross Stitch Halloween issue. We are doing the ink circle design called Fireburn in Cauldron Bubble on this pretty purple fabric using only black floss. Today's book is called The Suspects by Danielle Steele, and we are going to read at least one chapter out of the book, and then you can decide if you want to finish it by either purchasing it, which I will have the link below, or if you want to get it from your library. Also, the first thing I'm going to do is read you the description that is on Goodreads, and then when I'm done with the chapter, I will tell you my review of the book. So this is Suspects by Danielle Steele. A dedicated CIA agent becomes an unexpected ally to a woman haunted by the kidnapping of her family in this thrilling novel from #1 New York Times bestselling author Danielle Steele. Theodora Morgan is fashion royalty, founder of a widely popular online shopping service. She is one of the most successful businesswomen in the world, although she prefers to keep a low profile, especially over the last months. It was a year ago when the unthinkable struck her family and her husband, industry mogul Matthew Pasquier, and their son were kidnapped and held for ransom. A nightmare that ended in tragedy. The case has gone cold despite evidence linking the crime to Matthew's Russian competitors. Theo has reluctantly gone back to work running her company. On the flight to a launch party for one of her highly anticipated pop-up shops in New York City, she crosses paths with high society networker Pierre de Vermont. Theo politely invites him to her event, unaware that Pierre has been flagged by the CIA. Senior supervising CIA operative Mike Andrews investigates Pierre's suspicious Russian contacts and clears him to enter the country. But when he realizes that Theodora Morgan is on the same flight, he becomes concerned for her safety. Posing as a lawyer, Mike begins a covert mission, starting with Theo's opening party. When Mike and Theo meet, their connection is instant, but Theo is completely unaware of Mike's true objective or identity, or that the life she is rebuilding is in grave danger. Are we ready for the first chapter or two? Okay. Had to have some coffee. Chapter 1. Pierre de Vermont looked serious and elegant as he left his left bank Parisian apartment on the Rue Jacob in the fashionable 6th arrondissement. He hated early morning flights, but took them whenever he had meetings in New York. He would reach New York before noon, which gave him time for a lunch meeting and appointments in the afternoon. He was always booked in the evenings for major social events, important dinner parties, or discreet meetings that sometimes slid into unsavory activities if dictated by the people he was with. Pierre was versatile and open to almost anything. Tall, slim, handsome, with graying blonde hair. He was 46 years old and a matchmaker of sorts. He brought people together in order to facilitate unusual deals on a variety of matters, sometimes even very unlikely endeavors. He knew everyone worth knowing all over Europe and in the Middle East, and his connections now extended into Asia, with Chinese businessmen who had a great deal of money. Almost all his connections were with billionaires. Dave Romont made his living, a very handsome one, on commissions. What he did wasn't illegal, although he brushed along the edge of the respectable at times. The higher the risk, the more money involved, and the greater the profit. He was planning to meet with several different groups of people in New York. He only intended to stay there for a few days, depending on how successful his meetings were. He was involved in fashion on a massive scale, as well as luxury goods, real estate, technology, and oil. He had worked for years meticulously, placing himself in crucial positions so he would be able to introduce the right people to each other. And he took a handsome commission for doing so. People sought him out for his connections. He didn't need to chase them, not anymore. He had built up his business and his skills over the past 20 years. He was adaptable to all manner of situations and amenable to almost every kind of deal. He had started working in Europe and expanded to Russia, since he had grown up in Hong Kong when his father was in the diplomatic corps. He returned to France in his early 20s after his father's death. His mother had died when he was in boarding school in England. He had no family or attachments and no children. His father had left him some money, but not enough to live the way he wanted to, so he existed by his wits. He had always wanted to live well, envied people with a great deal of money, and had expensive taste. He spoke fluent Mandarin and Cantonese. Over the past 2 years, he had concluded several very lucrative deals in Russia and spoke Russian as well. His sexual preference was somewhat fluid and difficult to discern. He was often seen with well-known, very beautiful women, many of them married, and now and then he was in the company of very attractive young men. Whatever the pleasure of his clients was, he was happy to provide it, and had excellent connections for that too. He was a chameleon when he had to be. His reliable sources for difficult-to-obtain information served his clients well. His handsome features and innate elegance contributed to his image, and he didn't look his age. He liked the title of matchmaker, although he was neither sentimental nor interested in romance in the classic sense. In many ways, he was a most unusual man and a power broker among the ultriarch. He was indiscriminate and open-minded about who his clients were and how they had made their money. Everyone wanted to know Pierre de Vermont. Anyone who mattered already did, or they at least knew of him. He had the elegance of the French, the unfussy masculinity of the British, and a hint of Italian sex appeal. He would have made a perfect courtier in the court of Louis XVI. He thrived on intrigue. He was wearing an impeccably cut dark blue suit made by his tailor in London as he rode in the back of his Bentley on the way to the airport, driven by the chauffeur he used whenever he needed a driver. When he wished to be more discreet or incognito, he drove himself. He thoroughly enjoyed all the finer things in life. When he arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport, 2 members of the VIP staff were waiting at the curb to spot his Bentley. Then 2 more ground crew rushed out to greet him when his arrival was confirmed. He was well known to the airline of his choice. His luggage was whisked away and checked in immediately. He was then escorted to a private room in the first-class lounge, where a lavish buffet of what he liked to eat was set out just for him. He helped himself to a cup of strong coffee and some fruit, opened his computer, and, after thanking the assembled crew waiting to serve him, disappeared into what he saw on the screen. He would be boarded last, as he preferred, and would settle into his first-class seat, where he would stay for the flight and retreat behind the curtains that gave him privacy. He had flown over 1,000,000 miles, and his every preference was noted in the airline's VIP file and communicated to the crew aboard any flight he took. He had several meetings scheduled in New York and would be returning to Paris in a few days or a week at most. It was a long stay for him. Sometimes he flew in and out the same day for one important meeting. He liked closing most of his deals face-to-face, not by email, text, or phone. He was a compelling person and took full advantage of it to get the results he wanted. Pierre de Vermont had been sitting in his private room in the first-class lounge, drinking his second cup of coffee, when a chauffeur-driven Mercedes had pulled up to the first-class area at the curb. A man got out of the front seat, obviously a bodyguard, and a slim woman in a black hat with a wide brim and dark glasses waited in the back seat. The bodyguard took her passport to the first-class desk and checked her in. The staff at the desk nodded when they saw her name and allowed him to check her in without further questioning. They knew the procedures and had been warned of her arrival ahead of time, so there would be no mistakes. She was one of their most valuable clients, even more so than de Beaumont. It was the first trip Theodora Morgan had taken in over a year. She was the founder and very successful owner of Theo.com, a well-established internet shopping service that had broken all records of success worldwide. A year before, at 37, she was one of the most successful businesswomen in the world and a fashion icon herself, always photographed when she appeared in public, although she kept an intentionally low profile, particularly in the last year. She was also the recent widow of Matthew Pasquire, who owned more than a dozen of the biggest fashion brands in the world and was the acknowledged multi-billionaire mogul of luxury fashion. She and Matthew had met when she started her fledgling business at 22, fresh out of Harvard. She had started it on a shoestring and rapidly proved the business model's success. Financial journals and the business press began writing about her. Pasquire had made a point of meeting her. He was 25 years older than she and a ruthless businessman. He had fallen in love with her bold, adventuresome, innovative business plan, and her gentle, determined nature behind it, as well as her youth and beauty. After a rapid courtship, they were married a year later, and remained married for 14 years. She was his third wife, and he had no children, and she had enchanted him even further by giving birth to a son, Axel, 10 months after their wedding. Her own family history had prepared her for marriage to an older man. Her father was almost 20 years older than her mother, and they had a stable, loving home, where she had thrived as her parents' only child. She had often preferred the company of adults while growing up. Her parents included her whenever possible. She had a quiet nature and was an outstanding student. Her parents expected academic excellence from her and encouraged it. Her father greatly admired success in business. He had done all he could to assist her entrepreneurial dreams and help her to make them a reality. She had spent more time in college working on her business plans for the future than making friends. Her relationship with a much older man who was considered a genius in luxury retail seemed tailor-made for her. Her parents were reserved and only mildly concerned by her relationship with Matthew, I think it's Matthew. I don't know, Matthew initially, but they were supportive over time. Theo spoke adequate French when she and Matthew met. She studied diligently to improve it until she was fully fluent within a year for both business and social purposes, which made for a smooth transition when she moved to Paris for him. She had missed New York at first, but Paris rapidly became home and now she preferred it. She was a devoted mother, often working from home, brilliant at her own business, which she never merged with her husband's empire despite his entities. She remained independent professionally while still being a loving wife to him and mother to their only child. She adored their son Axel, who was the joy of her life, and her business was her passion. Her husband Matthew had been her mentor and best friend, and the marriage solid. Although strikingly beautiful, she had never looked at another man. It had all ended abruptly a year earlier when Matthew was kidnapped with their son at their country chateau, while Theo was in the city working. Both Matthew and Theo occasionally worked later than planned on Friday nights, in which case whichever parent was free would drive Axel to their chateau near Paris, and the other would arrive later. Matthew preferred having just the three of them on the weekends without staff underfoot. Theo liked that too. They were both surrounded by employees all week, and it was a relief to lead a simple life on Friday nights and Saturdays and Sundays and to fend for themselves. Sometimes Axel brought a friend, but he hadn't then. They valued their privacy and family time in contrast to the business pressures they dealt with during the week. Theo had had a late meeting. She couldn't escape on that frightful Friday, and Matthew had driven to the chateau with Axel toward the end of the afternoon. By the time Theo arrived shortly after 8 that night, they were both gone. She found one of Axel's run-in shoes on the front steps. The front door had been open. There were signs of a struggle, and with her heart pounding in terror, she called the police. Once they surveyed the scene, they in turn called the DGSI, the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Intérieure, the French equivalent of the FBI. After further investigation, when an empty pack of Russian cigarettes were found on the grounds, the case was then turned over to the DGSE, the French CIA, the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure. The strong suspicion then was that the kidnappers were foreign. The empty pack of Russian cigarettes had been found in a secluded area where the kidnappers had presumably lain in wait for Axel and Matthew. Once negotiations began, a translator had to be brought in to facilitate communications with the kidnappers, who proved to be Ukrainian. The DGSE had remained on the case since the criminals involved came from another country, and foreign informants had been used to try to discover who they were. The informants had not been able to provide conclusive information as to who had ordered the abduction. The DGSE had strong suspicions but no solid evidence, and the Russian and Ukrainian authorities could supply no factual corroboration of their theories. Not enough to make an arrest. The thugs who had kidnapped Axel and Matthew had vanished afterward. father and son had been kidnapped by 6 men who were seen wearing face masks and hoods driving away from the scene in a truck with a chase car, as observed by a neighboring farmer. There was no sign of Matteo and Axel in either vehicle. Both the truck and car were found abandoned in a nearby village. They were stolen vehicles. Negotiations for ransom of 100 million euros began the next day. It was clumsily handled by police who were trying to stall the kidnappers so the various authorities could discover their identities, but they failed to do so. The authorities delayed payment while frantically trying to find where father and son were being held. Theo begged the police to allow her to pay the ransom, which she could have done through her own business and Matteo's, and they finally allowed her to make a half a payment of 50 million, hoping to buy time to find Matteo, Axel, and the kidnappers in the area. The half payment enraged the kidnappers and caused them to panic. During the negotiations, they proved to be nervous, erratic, and unprofessional, arguing among themselves and with the police. The negotiations went on for 17 agonizing days, the longest in Theo's life. The police informed her that most kidnappings were handled in a business-like way and were all about obtaining money for some political or personal motive, and the victims were rapidly returned when the ransom was delivered. But given the kidnappers' lack of professionalism, the police convinced Theo that she would jeopardize Matteo's and Axel's lives if she stepped in with the full ransom. She trusted the authorities and later wished she hadn't. There were too many agencies involved and too many opinions. The police delivered half the ransom money, 50 million euro, to the kidnappers in a remote location as a further stalling tactic, while gathering more information. The kidnappers panicked, killed the 2 policemen who delivered it, took the money, and ran. Before they left the area, they killed Matteo and Axel and buried them in a mound of fresh dirt in a wooded area a few miles from the chateau to be sure that they'd be found. The police were able to deduce from the bullet wounds, the threads of Axel's clothing on his father's time of death, that Axel had been shot and killed in his father's arms, Matteo a short time later. After they were killed, they were found fairly quickly, as were the 2 dead policemen at the location of the drop. Theo remembered the days afterwards as a blur of grief and despair. She had gone into seclusion for a year, running her business from home, seeing no one except the CEOs of both companies, hers and Matteo's. She was trying to decide whether or not to sell everything. Nothing had any meaning for her after she lost her husband and son. The ransom money had turned up nowhere in Europe for the past year. The DGSE had no more evidence than they did the day that Matteo and Axel died. They had suspicions, but no hard facts, and the marked bills of the ransom money had disappeared. Despite appearing to behave like amateurs, the kidnappers had gotten away with committing a seemingly perfect crime, and Theo was left to live with the heartbreaking results. She hadn't left her Paris home in months, and her CEO, Jacques Fier, had finally convinced her to come back to work to solve some problems that no one else could handle as effectively. She had reluctantly agreed and was surprised that working grounded her. It was something she knew and was good at. Problem solving at Theo.com and at Matteo's company came naturally to her. It distracted her from thinking about her devastating losses, at least for the hours she was in the office. After that, she had to go home to her empty apartment and face the ghosts there. Her CEO's intention in bringing her back to work was his way of getting her back in the human race. He directed her attention to the pop-up stores they were setting up in Dallas, LA, and New York. Organizing the installations was a lot of work, but they had proved to be a highly efficient tool to attract new customers and increase sales and brand recognition globally. Theo had a magic touch with them. Even not at her best, her creative ideas were infallible, and a year after the tragedy, she was slowly returning to herself and hard at work, setting up the opening of the 3 upcoming concept stores in the States. She was going to travel herself to oversee the openings and execution of her designs for the 3 temporary stores. They were expensive to create, but it was always worth it. Although she was American and had grown up in New York, she had lived in France for almost half her life now, and she combined both a European and an American perspective. She had shifted her thriving operation from New York to Paris when she married Matteo. This also gave her access to his much bigger organization, and it had worked well. Matteo had given her office space in a building he owned and warehouse facilities, but she had never given him a share in her business, which amused him. He had liked to brag about how tough she was in business and how smart. Her father had been an investment banker who had advised her well about the principles of good business and entrepreneurship. She'd been an economics major at Harvard and graduated magna cum laude. She had planned to go on to business school, but had started her business first, and it took off at an astounding rate. She had a natural head for business, despite a gentle demeanor and feminine style that fooled people, particularly European men, into thinking they could take advantage of her. Matteo knew better and had enjoyed watching her operate with an iron hand. He had often asked her advice about his major luxury fashion brands, and the counsel she gave him was always excellent. She had exquisite taste and a definite style, and their marriage had been based on mutual admiration and respect. Theo had lived in a vacuum in a lonely, silent world for the past year. She rarely left their Paris home now and hadn't set foot in their chateau since the kidnapping. It was empty and closed and too full of terrible memories for her now. She had met with Jacques, her CEO, to continue to keep track of her business, and Matteo's CEO too, to keep an eye on his affairs and enormous enterprise. The rest of the time she wandered her home like a ghost, playing over and over again in her mind everything that had happened, and thinking how it could have been different. The French authorities had made all the wrong assumptions with disastrous results. The police had told her at the time that her son's death was an unfortunate accident of the event and proved that the kidnappers were amateurs. Professionals would have negotiated more efficiently and come to some agreement with her rapidly, and neither Matteo nor Axel would have gotten hurt. French, British, and other European authorities, as well as a network of informants, had been looking for answers, underground information, and the culprits for the past year to no avail. No one knew who the kidnappers were or where the 50 million euros she'd paid them had gone. They had wanted 100. The only motive that seemed likely to the police and DGSE was one of vengeance for a business venture that had gone wrong. Matteo had long been leery of opening stores in Russia. Their economy was too unstable and their business practices too unreliable and often shady. Despite his misgivings, a Russian investor had come along offering to put up 100 million euros to help defray the costs of setting up 2 flagship stores in Russia. An idea Matteo had begun to like increasingly and finally agreed to against his initial better judgment. The investor, Dmitry Alexander, was a billionaire himself and knew the Russian market. It was no secret that there was a great deal of money there and people eager to spend it. Setting up the two stores had rapidly become a nightmare, with people squandering money on bribes, delayed construction, and the cost being multiplied beyond all reason, with quality building materials being substituted with inferior ones. Matteo had finally lost patience and abandoned the project before the stores ever opened. It appeared to be the wisest decision, rather than continuing to throw money at the project and losing even more than the $200 million he had already put in. Matteo had lost a vast amount of money, but was relieved once he decided to get out. Their investor did not accept his losses with equanimity. He lost the $100 million he'd invested and a little more. Matteo graciously accepted his own losses and could afford to. His investor claimed he couldn't and said the loss would ruin him, which Matteo did not believe. The motive the French authorities felt was the correct one for the kidnapping and subsequent murders was that whoever had instigated it wanted to punish Matteo severely for pulling out and to recoup the bulk of their losses with the ransom. As far as the police were concerned, they considered it a business deal meant to put the money back in the pockets of the principal investor, Dmitry Alexander. He had powerful underworld connections, which protected him and kept him out of reach. According to informants, Matteo and Axel were supposed to be useful pawns and nothing more. They were leveraged to get the money back to Alexander for the failure to complete the two stores. But no one had been able to prove the theory. It was all guesswork. And the angry, disgruntled investor was a rich, successful man who was considered untouchable. The news of Axel's and Matteo's deaths had shocked the world and crushed Theo, but the story had slowly faded from the press, with no news since. The money still hadn't shown up, nor had the criminals who had killed her husband and son been caught. There was no justice in the story, nor any consolation for her, having lost a husband and son. Coming back from it over the past year had been an agony beyond measure, but her CEO had finally been able to convince her to go to New York and oversee the installation of 3 high-end pop-up stores of her brand in the States. No one understood their business and their customers as she did. She hadn't been seen in public or heard from for a year, and he convinced her it was time to venture into the world again. She wasn't enthusiastic about going, but she realized that she couldn't hide forever. Jack said that if she wanted to keep her business, she had to take control of it again. Her first days back had been a painful flood of vivid memories. There was to be a big, splashy party organized by a major New York PR firm to launch the opening of the New York pop-up, which would be open for 2 weeks. Theo had no intention of going to the event, but she was eager to see that the store was properly set up and the decor and atmosphere exactly right for their image. Similar events had been planned in LA and Dallas in the weeks following, and she intended to oversee them too. No promises had been made that she would attend the events, and there was no one in New York she wanted to see. Her parents were dead now, and she had lost track of old friends there. The brand and the business had been running smoothly without her being seen in public for a long time. Matteo's business was continuing to function efficiently too, managed by the same people who had worked for him when he was alive. His business was too large and solid to flounder, even once he was gone. She stayed in touch with their top management and sat on the board. She was active behind the scenes, particularly since she was the owner of Matteo's business now, although it interested her far less than her own brand, where her input made a real difference since it was smaller than Matteo's empire and rested on her image as well as the products they sold. The fact that she was going to New York to oversee the opening of the pop-up had not been announced, and she had no intention of being seen by the public before, during, or after the event. She just wanted to make sure that the large store they had rented for a fortune for 2 weeks on Madison Avenue would look spectacular. It felt both exciting and terrifying to Theo to be out in the world again. She had lived in the shadows for months now. She wanted to see the action again, but not be in it. She wanted to be invisible. Because the kidnappers hadn't been caught, she had to travel with a bodyguard and have one with her whenever she left her house, even for a walk. There was a large rotation of them, which her assistant Martine arranged. Theo liked some of her guards better than others, but she needed protection in case the kidnappers came back for her too. It was a remote possibility she couldn't ignore. According to the police, for the most part, she detested not having the freedom to go anywhere alone. But thanks to Mathos, she owned one of the largest, most successful businesses in the world now, and was as big a target as her late husband had been, in some ways even more so, as a woman in that position. The police thought it unlikely that the same group of men would return, but since they hadn't gotten the $100 million they had come for, the authorities felt that it was not entirely impossible that the kidnappers would try to abduct her now for the rest. She had all the correct papers and powers of attorney in place, so the CEO of Matthew's company could pay the ransom in a relatively short time if she was abducted. They knew what to expect now. There were times in the last year when she didn't care if they took her. Without her son, she had nothing left to live for. She dreaded the long years ahead without him, and neither business was enough to feed her spirit and keep her going. Her passion for her business had waned, so it had been a particularly major victory for the CEO of her own company when he convinced her to go to New York. She had finally agreed at the last minute. She was thinking about what she had to do when she arrived, while she waited in her car for news of the delayed flight. There was supposedly a minor mechanical problem on the plane, which they were promising to repair as soon as possible. She didn't mind the delay. She had no meetings and no set plans. She was just going to supervise the final build-out and look of the pop-up. The temporary New York hires did not even know she was coming. She wanted no focus or attention on her. She hoped to sleep on the flight, since sleep still eluded her on most nights. Pierre de Beaumont was still in the first-class lounge, working on his computer and annoyed by the delay, which might cause him to have to cancel his lunch meeting. He had already had a second cup of coffee, and the ground crew left him alone in solitary splendor with the VIP team hovering nearby just outside the door of the private salon. Pascal Martin sat at his desk.
Give me a minute.
Head of security at Charles de Gaulle Airport, in the job he'd had for 15 years. It had gotten infinitely more complicated in recent times with mounting concern about terrorism and attacks on other airports. They'd been lucky at CDG so far. One of the new elements he hated dealing with were the more stringent regulations for all flights with destinations in the United States. United States Homeland Security expected them to hold inbound flights to the U.S. to a higher standard of security and respect their no-fly list at all times. They required the authorities of the airlines and the airport to submit the manifest for each flight so the American authorities could run the passenger list through their computers and make sure that no undesirables and potential terrorists would slip in unnoticed. It meant delays on almost every flight while they waited for clearance from Homeland Security and at times the CIA, in case of some doubt. Meanwhile, unsuspecting passengers were told there was a minor mechanical problem on the plane, which was then magically fixed once the manifest was cleared. With fair regularity, passengers who did not meet with U.S. approval were removed from the plane before they boarded. If they let the plane take off without final clearance from the U.S., they ran the risk that the incoming international flight would be refueled on the runway and sent back to its original point of departure without letting a single passenger disembark. It made for hundreds of irate passengers, so Pascal had learned that it was better to let them wait during a delayed departure than to send them home from an aborted round trip, which was much worse. U.S. regulations about who flew and who didn't were tougher than those in any other country. It was their way of keeping out dangerous elements, and they made it tougher all the time. Occasionally, a passenger they singled out was a false alarm, but even Pascal agreed that it was better to be on the safe side, even though it caused him untold aggravation at times. He'd had stomach problems and high blood pressure for the past 3 years. He couldn't wait to retire in 5 years. Meeting the stringent American security procedures took time, and they couldn't explain it to the passengers since no one officially admitted to the no-fly list. He'd had a call from the head of the ground crew of a major airline saying a first-class passenger on their early New York flight had been flagged as a potential problem. Worst of all, the circumstances weren't clear. He wasn't on the no-fly list that Homeland Security denied having, but the code that came up next to his name indicated that they needed additional clearance to allow him to enter the U.S. It appeared to be a gray area, which Pascal hated most. If they took him off the flight, he could sue the airline for the embarrassment and business meetings he missed. If they left him on, the plane and its passengers could be turned around and sent back to Paris from New York without a single passenger able to get off. Shit, Pascal said to himself as he read the printout and knew what it meant. Questionable passenger, clearance required. It was 1 a.m. in New York. The flight was due to take off from Paris in an hour, and at that time it wouldn't be easy to reach someone at Homeland Security in New York who could give them clearance. He could feel his stomach start to churn and tighten, which was part of the job now. His wife wanted him to take early retirement, but most of the time he still enjoyed his job when he didn't have a problem like this one. Pascal knew who to call at Homeland Security at JFK and had the contact's personal cell phone number. He hated to use it if it wasn't a real emergency, but it could easily become one, particularly from a PR standpoint for the airline. He looked for the number on his phone and found it easily. He wondered if his counterpart in New York had high blood pressure too, but Pascal didn't want to make the decision alone. The burden and the fallout were too heavy to have solely on his own shoulders. On mornings like this, he didn't enjoy his job and wished he'd had stayed in the military. Things had been so much simpler there. There were fewer gray areas than he dealt with almost daily at Charles de Gaulle. Okay, there is still more to this chapter. It still goes on and on and on, but I think you get enough of it to decide if you want to finish reading it. I gave this a 5-star rating. So hold Hold on a second. I gotta rub my eye. My review says, Theodora Morgan is a high-fashion businesswoman. She doesn't like to be in the limelight. She keeps a low profile. And as you heard, a year ago, her husband and 13-year-old son were kidnapped, held for ransom. Things did not go well, and they were killed. It is still an ongoing investigation where there doesn't seem to be any leads, and Theo decided she needs to get back into work, and she goes to New York and a few other places to open up her pop-up stores. She crosses paths with high society networker Pierre de Beaumont, and Theo politely invites him to her event, unaware that Pierre had been flagged by the CIA. Senior supervising CIA operative Mike Andrews, who we have not even heard from yet in this chapter, he investigates Pierre's suspicious Russian contacts and clears him to enter the country. So, posing as a lawyer, Mike begins a covert mission, starting with Theo's opening party. And when Mike and Theo meet, their connection is instant. He doesn't know why he's drawn to her, and she is really nice to him. The friendship these two make throughout this book seem instant but natural, and they start seeing each other. He is very concerned, though, for her safety and has people checking up on her and about the case involving her husband and son. So I really, really liked this relationship between Mike and Theo. I received this arc from NetGalley and Random House for me to review. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a little slow at the beginning because they were trying to let you know what had happened and who the characters were in the book and their background. And then once we get all that information, once Theo ends up getting to New York, that's when it all becomes fun. Well, I wouldn't say fun, but it goes a little bit quicker, and I really enjoyed this book, and like I said, I gave it 5 stars. And I'm a big Danielle Steele fan anyways, but yeah, this book was really good. Let me know what you think. Are you going to purchase it, get it from the library, or skip it altogether? And that's it for this week's Stitch with Me and a Book. You all have a great evening or a great day, great weekend, and I will talk to y'all later. Love you guys. Bye-bye.